check that out. Um, so thank you very much. And our next speaker is Patrick Curry. He is a Canadian-born writer and scholar living in London. He holds a PhD in history and philosophy of science and has been a lecturer at the University of Kent and Bath Spa University. He remains a tutor at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. He is the author of Enchantment, Wonder in Modern Life, and Ecological Ethics, among many other books. He edits one of my favorite online publications, The Ecological Citizen. Dr. Curry will answer questions typed into the Q&A at the end of his talk. So please welcome Dr. Patrick Curry. You want to unmute there.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. At least it's evening here. And I'm very happy to be here. My subject is kind of double. It's the enchantment of nature, but also the nature of enchantment. I'm very interested in the experience of wonder. In and as nature, most of what I'm going to say arises out of my own understanding, and both personal and scholarly, of what it is and what it isn't. But I'll intersperse 3 other people's eyewitness accounts. So better to give you a feeling of it and prevent things from getting too dry. So enchantment is a fundamental human experience. It's the experience of wonder. So it's necessarily participatory. You're in there, and therefore it's necessarily personal. Somebody needs to be actually present for it to happen. If you stay on the outside, merely observing, it can't happen. The word itself, enchantment, implies as much. It's from the French, originally from the Latin, enchantement, to be in a song or in the singing. So by extension, it might arise from finding yourself in a song that you are hearing or that you are singing, or in a picture that you're looking at, or in a story that you're reading or hearing. In fact, in any kind of narrative in the broadest sense. And the broadest sense here extends well beyond human art to say, perhaps, the story of life on Earth. That's a story too. As William Blake puts it in his inimitably forthright way, quote, "To the eyes of the man of imagination, nature is imagination itself." Now, wonder, it varies a lot in intensity. It can be merely charming, so charm, to delight and delightful, to full-blown joy. And we also could say awe. I don't describe it as pleasure because the quality of that is a little different. But the last kind, joyful enchantment, is what I call radical. It is normally something which only happens a few times in your life. And whenever it does, it's almost always life-changing. Now, one important way we can throw light on a concept is, or value, is to ask what it isn't. In this case, a clear opposite of wonder is will. Any desire or effort to make something happen, to change something, or to make someone, including yourself, do something. If that is what is happening, then enchantment is not. Okay, time for my first account of natural enchantment. It's a report dated March 23rd, 1926, by a Mr. E.O. Grant, as reported by the wonderful writer E.B. White. It's short and simple, but to get the full import, you should factor in the ultra-laconic verbal style of New England rural folk. Saw a farmer near Patten, Maine, sitting on a snowdrift about 15 feet high, surrounded by 100 redpolls. Birds perched on the farmer's head and shoulders. One sat on knee. Farmer told Grant he had enjoyed the previous half hour more than any other period in his life. Now, a fundamental characteristic of enchantment is that it is always relational. The extent of the reciprocity varies with the degree of intensity, but it's always at least wonder at another, not power over them. It takes place as an encounter, a meeting across a gap of difference. And those boundaries remain. They don't disappear, but they no longer matter so much. So enchantment is neither hot, ecstatic unity in which both self and other disappear, nor is it cold, one-way control over the other. And when it's radical, it is most relational, with both parties, whoever they are and whatever they are, apprehending and affecting the other. Furthermore, as in any true relationship, no one's in charge. What happens is determined jointly and recursively, not only by one party or the other. In other words, enchantment is essentially wild, or what somebody I know calls unbiddable. And this is something it shares, of course, with wild nature. In the whole more than human natural world, to use David Abrams' excellent phrase, including us, but vastly greater, there are many, countless, in fact, agents, subjects, and interests at play, and very few outcomes are entirely predictable. That is why J.R.R. Tolkien, one of enchantment's most reliable scholars, I found, insists that enchantment is what he calls perilous. It's also why it arrives as a gift, or not at all. What kind of relationship are we talking about? The poet W.H. Auden distinguishes very helpfully between true and false enchantment. In the true kind, you just want the enchanting other to flourish, to be well, for their own sake. With false enchantment, in contrast, you want, quote, either to possess the other or be possessed by them, end quote. Tolkien, who was Auden's teacher in Oxford, asserts that enchantment is ultimately, quote, a love and respect for all things, animate or inanimate, an unpossessive love of them as other. And he adds that, quote, this love will produce both ruth, which is an old English word meaning pity, empathy, or compassion, and delight. So we can see quickly by implication that where ruthlessness or despair dominate, enchantment is absent. Now, the other party in this process can be anyone or anything. A human being, another animal, a plant, a place of any kind, a sight, sound, smell, taste, texture, or even idea. But we are a particular kind of being, that is to say, particular kind of animal. We are earthlings, but we are the human kind. And human nature is not, whatever some of our pretensions may say, infinitely plastic. So enchantment tends to happen with certain kinds of others and in certain domains. For example, love, art, religion, food and drink, learning, sports, humor, and of course, not least, nature. When radical, that means apprehending in all its complexity and beauty and mystery, a natural place or a fellow creature who sometimes also, quite unexpectedly, apprehends you. I believe that all enchantments are ultimately natural, rooted in nature, including ourselves as natural beings. The fact that our nature includes culture doesn't really change that. In other words, enchantment, like life itself, is not anthropocentric. It's not all about us. It includes us, but it isn't all about us, let alone all about me. In the process of enchantment, the other becomes, the other party, whoever or whatever it is, becomes, and at the same time is realized to already be, in effect, another person with a personality, unique personality of their own. Or we could say an extraordinary presence. They have an extraordinary presence. And presence is something that takes place upstream of any distinction between subject and object. So we should resist any attempt to understand enchantment as merely subjective or merely objective. Radical enchantment is a whole body-mind and therefore whole world experience. As the philosopher Wittgenstein says, physiological life is of course not life, and neither is psychological life. Life is the world, including us, but not only us. Now, experiences of enchantment like this are obviously intensely meaningful, and therefore they are fateful. Even refusing them is fateful. Difficult to do, but possible. But even that is fateful because it always happens too late. You've already been affected. By the same token, enchantment is mythic. There's many modes of mythicity, and some of them have nothing whatsoever to do with wonder. Think of warfare, for example, in some of its aspects. But when you are enchanted, you are living mythically. And although I cannot really go into it in detail now, in this respect too, enchantment is rooted in nature. Because ultimately, as the mythographer Sean Kane says, myths are not about the gods so much as what he describes as the ideas and emotions of the earth, which is where even the gods come from. And what does enchantment show us about the enchanting other? I think it partly reveals and partly creates a truth about them. It shows us their intrinsic value and meaning, which doesn't depend in any way on their usefulness or their exchange value in the market and so on. Okay? William James gives almost a parable about this. Every Jack, he says, sees in his own particular Jill charms and perfections to the enchantment of which we stolid onlookers are stone cold. And which has the superior view of the truth, he or we? Which has the more vital insight into the nature of Jill's existence as a fact? William James's answer is Jack, of course, for he, quote, realizes Jill concretely, and we do not. Time for my second account. This is the writer Richard Mabey describing listening to a nightingale sing in a Suffolk fen under a full moon one early night in May. He sings a stylish 4-note phrase, then repeats it in a minor key. He slides into a bubbling tremolo on a single note and holds it for more than 10 seconds. How does he breathe? I cannot believe he is not consciously improvising. I want to clap, and with barely credible timing, a shooting star arcs over the bush in which he's singing. I'm edging closer now without realizing it and am no more than 10 feet away. Nothing stops the flow of notes. They fill the air. They seem to be solid, to be doing odd things to the light. I'm half aware that my peripheral vision is closing down and I'm riveted to the bush by this tunnel of intense sound. At that point, quote, just for a few seconds, the bird was in my head and it was me that was singing, end quote. Then remembering Shelley's lines describing the effect of Nightingale's song as so sweet that joy is almost pain, Mabey questions his own response. And the effort breaks the spell, and he walks regretfully away. This is an absolutely classic instance of enchantment. It includes sheer presence, participation, the relationality of wonder at. It's embodied, especially as the sense of hearing, and embedded in a very particular place. The concrete magic of the bird singing, at once material and spiritual, and an aspect of enchantment I haven't been able to touch on here, namely what you might call the tensive truth of living metaphor. It's metaphor, but it's a living metaphor, not literary metaphor. Because Mabey is both himself and a human and a nightingale. And at that moment, he is both singing and not singing. The human isn't singing, the bird is, but he is the bird as well as himself. From this, we can also see that enchantment takes place as a unique moment, short but deep, in the words of an artist, E.T.L. Adner. So it doesn't happen in time, and as a unique place, so it doesn't happen in space either. Let's look at the moment first. Often it's a case of nothing has happened, but everything has changed. And in that moment of enchantment, time radically slows down. But it doesn't altogether stop. And sooner or later, the enchantment comes to an end. Like they used to say about love, love is forever while it lasts. It's something like that. So the wonder of childhood is continually becoming grown up. Wild nature is always falling to so-called development. The elves are forever passing over the sea, leaving us behind on the darkening shores of Middle-earth in, God help us, the age of men, now known as the Anthropocene. So the joy of enchantment is often bittersweet, with a poignant or melancholy quality. By the same token, the quality of enchantment is not so much desire as it is yearning or longing. The result can be a kind of weird preemptive nostalgia. In the words of the great haiku poet Basho, quote, "Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo cry, I long for Kyoto." Let's turn to place. Tolkien's name for the place of enchantment is fairy, and he describes it this way. He says it's the realm or state in which fairies have their being. But fairy contains many things besides elves and fays. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves when we are enchanted, end quote. So fairy is the place you find yourself in when you're enchanted, and it is what the place where you are then becomes, wherever that is. And as Tolkien implies, that place is very roomy. In the words of a character from John Crowley's wonder tale, Little Big, quote, "The farther in you go, the bigger it gets, until at the center point it is infinite, or at least very, very large." Now, the difference between infinite and very, very large is rather important, just as the difference between time stopping and time going very, very slowly. Because very, very large, even that big, ultimately has its limits. And just as enchanted moments cannot last forever, however much they feel that way at the time, we cannot stay forever in fairy, only visit or be visited by it. After all, we're humans, not elves. It follows that a healthy relationship with enchantment needs not a fluffy, weak ego at all, but just the opposite, a strong ego to let go when needs must, and not to fall into futile grasping or clinging if possible. Of course, it's not always possible. When it came time for her to leave her beloved Kenya, Karen Blixen found that, quote, "It was not I who was going away. I did not have it in my power to leave Africa. It was the country that was slowly and gravely withdrawing from me, like the sea at ebb tide," end quote. The philosopher Max Weber described, or rather defined, enchantment as concrete magic. Now, what he meant by that was it is both utterly particular, this person in this precise moment and place, and at the same time inexhaustibly mysterious. In other words, enchantment in its combination of moment and place and presence is both embodied, even carnal, and spiritual. As I've said after Wittgenstein, life is neither subjective nor objective, neither just a state of mind nor just a condition of the world. It's both. And as an especially intense experience of being alive, so is enchantment both. This means that it doesn't fall under the rule of either of what Gregory Bateson called our two dominant species of superstition. On the one hand, the purportedly pure physicality of scientific materialism, and on the other hand, the supposedly pure spirituality of romantic supernaturalism. It just doesn't fit that grid. It's upstream of it, as I said. So the spiritual dimension of enchantment, its magic, is not something floating above concrete circumstances, not something added to it, as the word supernatural implies. It only exists in and as those precise circumstances. So it's not the contrary of the world of senses, but in the words of another philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, it is its lining and its depth. So the magic or the spirituality of enchantment is the meaning of those circumstances, which doesn't exist separately from them, but isn't precisely identical with them either. And the farther into this you go, the more, in other words, imminently, the more transcendental it becomes. Right, getting a little abstract here. So it's time for the third account. It's one of my own, which I tell because it shows how a natural enchantment goes even further in challenging the modernist prejudice that I'm sometimes concerned about, which confines subjectivity to inside human heads, as if the mind had an inside or an outside, sometimes begrudgingly extended to a few so-called higher animals. Because this time, as actually often happens, the enchanting other is not a biological entity, strictly speaking. It's a place, a wild place, which nonetheless is a person, or at least has a personality. In his classic Wonder Tale of 1871, the fairy tale writer George MacDonald says that in the country at the back of the north wind, there is a river that, quote, flows not through but over grass. Its channel, instead of being rock, stones, pebbles, sand, or anything else, was of pure meadow grass, not overlong, end quote. In 2004, a friend took me for a walk in a park in Shishigahara Shitsugan at the foot of Mount Chokai in Akita Prefecture, Japan. And there, in a forest at the foot of the mountain, although not looking for McDonald's river, I found it. I had never been for a walk with a river before. Not by, but with. It flowed freely where it would, not taking a predetermined course or even a self-created course in a riverbed, but among grass, moss, and dead leaves through the middle of the forest. And we walked alongside it, the three of us, the river, my friend, and myself, keeping each other company. The glowing blues and greens of the photographs I took were so intense that most people seeing them assumed they had been photoshopped. What an imagination my camera must have. At this point, I can almost hear the modernists who police this sort of thing wheeling out all the usual instruments for suppressing non-human agency and protecting human privilege or even human supremacy. I must have been projecting, or imagining, or fantasizing. But if an experience is upstream of any foundational split between object and subject, it can't be disqualified as merely subjective by wielding a rhetorical objectivity. As Wittgenstein also says, quote, if everything believes as if a sign had meaning, then it does have meaning. Let's return to my earlier claim that all enchantments are natural. It would be easy to go through the various kinds or sites of enchantment and show the inalienably natural dimension of each. Erotic or romantic love without bodies would certainly be a novelty. Even virtual bodies are an impoverished version of actual bodies. But although non-sexual, embodiment is no less integral to the presence of a beloved child or friend. Every art, I think I can say, without exception, offers an engagement with at least one of the senses and requires that engagement in order to be apprehended. So that would be the spiritual lining and meaning or depth of the object is apprehended through, in, and as the object, which then becomes a subject. Religion. I think where ritual is concerned, religious ritual, its precise, concrete specificities are as important as their religious meaning. In fact, they're inseparable from their religious meaning. Food and drink. I don't think I need to say anything about why embodiment and nature are present there. Learning. Neither teaching nor learning without the world. Sports. There's no purely mental or spiritual sport, not even chess or Go. Humor. What laughs, so to speak, or who laughs? And can there be laughter without it? All these experiences are relational and wonder at, enchantment by. That's another way of saying that they are ecological in the broadest and deepest sense. They take place in nature as experiences of concrete magic, in which the carnal embodiment of the enchanted is actively present, as is that of the enchanting one in whatever form. And ultimately, they occur as nature, instances or incarnations of the more than human world, which includes us as natural beings. I dare say that a more than human natural world is quite capacious enough to also include spirits, gods or goddesses, even, I dare say, cyborgs. So enchantment is, I think, an inalienable part of life. It's our birthright. It results from being alive, and it involves an awareness, a love, an appreciation of being alive in that moment, in that place. So however imperiled it is, and I don't deny that in many ways it is, its potential is inherent in being alive, precisely as embodied, ecological, interdependent, finite earthlings. But it's also wonder, as I said, at being alive. It's an astonishing and humbling apprehension of what Merleau-Ponty calls wild being, incarnated as this particular, precious, vulnerable other, triumphantly themselves, before another one, affirmed in your affirmation of them, you. So despite its apparent fluffiness, enchantment is powerful and important, and it has profound pragmatic consequences, not least consequences respecting our relationship with the natural world. Because in the end, we will only fight to defend what we have been enchanted by and what we have learned in that way to value and love. Reason alone, although very important, And science alone, although very important, aren't enough when they stand alone. This point finds a special resonance, I think, in the most serious crisis of all that is facing us. Not COVID-19, but the ecocide of which the pandemic is only one result. Again, good policy and science are needed, but without personal wonder in and at the natural world, they are ultimately blind. It is enchantment that opens our eyes. Thank you. I'm afraid I finished far too early. I do apologize. I hope there's some questions. Otherwise, well, whatever you want to do, Liz.
Well, I'm sure there will be. I want to thank you for that wonderful description and exploration of enchantment, and encourage the audience to put their questions in the Q&A. I think there are some questions from your fellow panelists to begin with. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free. It's okay to go first. No? Okay. So, let's see. I was very interested in the examples that you gave of enchantment, especially because most of them had to do with the natural world.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you found more recent ones, or if this kind of experience requires a sort of slowing down that we don't have anymore.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's delicate. It's difficult to do this question justice. I mean, if you're walking around a lot of the time, maybe even most of the time, glued to a screen, an electronic screen in front of you that you're carrying with you, well, that I think that does create problems. That's not a form of receptive receptivity to what is happening around you. The ideal attitude was described by the writer Freya Stark as a fearless receptivity, being the best kind of attitude to have, the one that invites enchantment to happen. If your attention is already caught and compelled by what's on the screen, which of course is precisely what the screen is designed to do, then enchantment is less likely to happen. I'm not going to say it can't happen, because you can't fence it out or any more than you can fence it in. Okay, so there could be an experience of enchantment through interacting with the internet or the web or whatever. But I do think it's safe to say that the circumstances of social media and the internet reduce the possibility of that happening, precisely because they have been so carefully designed for a particular end, in particular for false enchantment. Remember, the definition of false enchantment is the desire to possess or be possessed by the other. That's exactly what all those machines are designed to make you want to do. So in that sense, they're a form of, not of enchantment, but magic. And Tolkien drew a very strong distinction between enchantment and magic. Enchantment being a state of wonder. And if you remember, I contrasted it with will as the opposite. Well, magic is a sophisticated and kind of will. It's if you look carefully into magic, both historically and substantively, it's pretty much always about changing something in the world or in a person or in yourself. Lately, definitions of magic have been like technique to raise my consciousness. Well, yeah, sorry, that's still will. That's still will. And where will is happening, enchantment can't really get a look in. So I would say that the circumstances of the way many of us are living now are not conducive to enchantment. Yeah. Should I be reading?
Roger, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask it directly because I've just failed to type it in on the Q&A. So
Okay.
But there we are. But I've been making links between a lot of the speakers today and the poetry, and I was thinking about a poem we heard earlier this evening for me, this afternoon for you guys. I'm 6 hours ahead of you. By David Cruz, where he was talking about things being miraculous and utterly ordinary at the same time. And there's a lot of what you said about dualities of metaphorical and literal, subjective and objective. And then I looped back again to the idea about river estuaries ebbing and flowing, where they are at the same moment. So I was wondering about if you could say something about enchantment. Is it completely about transformation, or is it more to do with actually being on the cusp of dualities, or even the possibility of two states coexisting? Like, I don't want to get into the Copenhagen theory of quantum mechanics here, but things sort of being in two states. Okay, but and then maybe if it's not too much, what that says about the creative impulse, the creative spirit.
That shouldn't take long.
Okay, right. Okay.
Look, I see that there's a question from Sherry.
I
just want you to know, Sherry, I know that, and I will come back to it. Right. So, is enchantment about transformation? I think the short answer would be no, because enchantment isn't about anything, and it isn't for anything. Which is not to say that it can't have profound effects, including transformative effects. But it's not for that or about that. That's how I would put that point. As for being on the cusp of dualities, I think there's definitely something to that. If we were enchanted, permanently enchanted 24/7, enchantment would disappear. Alternatively, you could say that would be a psychotic state, not an enchanted state. It's the very, and at least important part, it's the very contrast between our normal, daily, quotidian, Monday morning, 9 o'clock, non-enchanted state, and enchantment when it happens, when it comes along. And it's partly it's informed by our awareness. Something extraordinary is happening here, not ordinary. Pay attention. What is this showing me? What is this person or place or whoever the other is? What are they showing me? So I think it's important to realize that enchantment is not a state of ultimate unity. It's not a sort of orgasmic, cosmic unity in which subject and object disappear, because then there's no one to experience enchantment. In fact, there's no anything in that state. So just as enchantment is not like my control over you as an object, I can manipulate, exploit, whatever, this other thing, because it's not a subject. It's not that. But it's also not cosmic unity. And the polarities, the differences, the boundaries don't disappear in enchantment, but you've resolved them, at least momentarily. One important image of enchantment is a bridge. In fact, bridges are places that are prone to enchantment. Incidentally, so are doorways from one room to another. So are stairways from one level to another level. All these liminal in-between spaces, precisely between the dualities that you mentioned, are places where enchantment tends to happen. And in that moment, you might experience being in both rooms at the same time, which in another way, of course, you're not, because you can't be. Or being like Richard maybe experienced himself as the nightingale. Well, it doesn't mean that he stopped being a human being. He carried on being a human being, but he was also a nightingale.
Mm.
So think about, I sort of see why you've mentioned quantum physics, although I really don't want to go there. I'm not qualified to, for one thing. But paradox, when you get into deep levels of enchantment, paradox is very frequently present in a way that completely ignores the usual rules of Aristotelian logic, the law of contradiction, non-identity, etc. All that goes out the window. I'm not suggesting we should throw all that out the window because it's very important in other contexts, but enchantment doesn't pay any attention to it. So there's lots of quotations by Niels Bohr which seem to show that he understood enchantment very well, at least in the context of enchantment. Yeah. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, and I'm glad you just started off with by saying, you can't really define it or explain it, because I was refer to those great poets Rogers and Hammerstein, who said some enchanted evening. Who can explain it? Who can tell you why? Fools will give you answers, wise men never try. So thank you for giving such a wise answer.
That was close. Okay, so I'm going to turn to Sherry's question. I suppose you can all see it, but I'll read it anyway. I'm wondering if you can expand on the thought that you can't find enchantment when you go looking for it, or when you try to create scenarios where it emerges. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if enchantment is wild, and I'm convinced it is, and therefore unbiddable, you can't tell it what to do. You can't make it do what you want it to do. That means you can't order it up. It's not under your control. In fact, if it was under your control, how fine would that be? You would know that it only happened because you made it happen. Well, that's completely boring. So it's essential to its nature that it arrives as a gift, or not at all. However, if you're someone who's, for example, someone whose work involves perhaps wanting to enchant, perhaps you want to enchant through your the art that you're engaged in, the painting you're creating, or the play that you're putting on, or whatever. Where does this wildness, unbiddability leave you? Well, what it means is you can and should work very hard, use all your will, all your skill to try and create the conditions that are propitious for enchantment. You can invite it in. You can leave the door open. And by the way, of course, you can do all this in your normal daily life as well. You can leave I like the image of leaving the door open or leaving the window open. If it wants to attend, it will. And you can actually create conditions that are propitious for it, such as, for example, not over-controlling. That's very important. Okay. That doesn't mean it will attend, but it is more likely to, let's say. And how wonderful if it does. So that's all you can do, but believe me, that's a lot of work already. So it's enough. I hope that maybe answers your question.
I could combine two questions, one from the Q&A and one from the chat.
Okay.
Simon says, thanks, Patrick. That was beautiful. Is lockdown anti-enchantment, although it is on the surface about preserving life? And then poet D.O. asks, walking through a clear-cut or destroyed natural area makes many of us heartsick. Do you feel that is disenchantment? And is that the opposite of enchantment?
Both very good questions. Okay, the first one was again? The first question?
Is lockdown anti?
Oh, lockdown, yes, lockdown, yes. I think lockdown has been, well, obviously many people are in dire straits as a result of lockdown in various ways. In fact, one of the potential charges against making a fuss about enchantment or wonder is, look, all these people are in desperate circumstances. Some of them, they're even in fear of their lives, or they haven't got enough to eat. And so how can you talk about wonder, for God's sake? And I say, well, I appreciate that, but you know what? You don't want to take something else away from them too, do you? I mean, you don't want to take away even the possibility that even they, in those circumstances, may, in certain ways, in certain respects, experience wonder. I think that would be just the final indignity. So I appreciate that point, but I don't think it means we shouldn't think about it or care about it. I think lockdown, even for people who are materially secure, has been very difficult because a great deal of enchantment comes from our interpersonal relationships with other human beings, although not only other human beings by any means. But I don't know about anybody else, but my social life has taken a hell of a knock with lockdown. It's become practically planning a military campaign to meet somebody, a friend on the other side of London, and go for a walk in a park with them. And that's not very enchanting. On the other hand, it has made people perhaps appreciate their bits of nature, their local bits of nature more. And if you have what's called somewhat mysteriously sometimes an inner life, that has helped. And in some respects, perhaps for some people, their inner life has come more to life, and in that sense been enchanting. So a very mixed bag, I think. On the question of disenchantment, I mean, yes, this is a very important distinction I'd like to make that I didn't make, is between lack of enchantment and actual, as it were, positive disenchantment. Okay, a lack of enchantment is perfectly normal, part of our lives, nearly every day, probably, or actually, yes, every day. And nothing wrong with that. However, there is such a thing as actual disenchantment, as the contrary of enchantment, as perhaps the opposite of enchantment. And there are very powerful programs, will to knowledge, will to power driven programs for disenchantment, actually actively trying to disenchant the world and trying to disenchant us, because you see, if it's true what I said earlier, that enchantment reveals the intrinsic value of the other, then another way to express enchantment is not for sale. Sorry, not for sale at any price. Well, that creates a lot of problems for capital. Capital wants an absolutely free, unimpeded circulation of capital without people, pesky people saying, I'm sorry, we like these trees where they are. And no, we won't be fobbed off by your promise to plant 100 new trees somewhere else. It's these trees that we want. And so on, you see. So creates a problem for what I call the mega machine. By the way, I've discussed, I'll put in a plug, why not? I've discussed all these issues in more depth in a book called Enchantment. So the mega machine being a combination of capital, more or less the boss, technoscience, certain aspects of highly technological science, and what's the third wheel? It's not the media. Anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. And the mega machine in this sense has programs of disenchantment. And so when you, as you say, walk in a clear-cut forest and feel what that feels like, you are experiencing the presence, as it were, of disenchantment. And you're not imagining it.
There are a couple questions about the relationship between love and the muse and enchantment, and they sort of morph into questions about art. about, for example, if you're trying to take a photograph to capture the moment, would that interfere with the moment of enchantment? So maybe you could discuss that holistically.
Well, I want to come back to the idea of fearless receptivity, Freya Stark's phrase, although T.W. Adorno used the phrase quite close, but not exactly the same, fearless passivity. I prefer fearless receptivity. So you can go looking for that photograph. I suppose you could go looking for that person. But the really important thing is to be open to them presenting themselves to you. If and when they do show up, the enchanting moment or person or whatever it is, to be there for it, to be there for them. You can't make them appear. And you can't really even systematically go looking for them. Well, obviously you can go looking for them, but there's absolutely no guarantee of success. It's more important to be ready in some way. And that relates to an idea I like very much, which is summed up in the term animism. I believe animism is sort of our default spiritual position as earthlings. And how I define it is the practice, the principled practice of remaining open as you go through life, as you follow your path, of being open to agency and subjectivity, and therefore relationship, wherever it pops up, wherever it manifests, and not policing that, going, oh, I thought that tree said something to me, but trees can't communicate, so it couldn't possibly have said anything to me. I must have imagined that oh, please, just drop all that modernist policing. If the tree said something to you, listen. I think animism is a pretty good term for describing that, and it's a practice I would recommend. As for art, love, you know, that's kind of tricky. Buy my book. Anyway.
So one of the, I think one of the questions that's related to that is, can the capitalist economy make money from enchantment, or at least can they try?
Yes, of course they try all the time, but of course enchantment, the real thing, enchantment, is no use to them at all, precisely because it's wild and unbiddable and can't be controlled. So what they've done is they've created a simulacrum, an imitation of enchantment, which I call glamour. And glamour is very biddable. It's virtually a slave to whatever you want to do with it. And the industries that depend on glamour, which glamour is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and particularly in the industries of advertising, spin, surveillance, particularly advertising. And let's not forget that Google, Facebook, etc., ultimately they're advertising companies. So they want to give you an experience that is like enchantment. Oh, this usual ridiculous advertisements about, okay, if you buy one of these cars, you will find yourself driving along this deserted coastal road, and sitting beside you will be this gorgeous other person, and this is what it would feel like. So it's kind of like enchantment, but it's not enchantment. It's glamour, okay, which is manipulable and very much targeted for a very specific purpose, the purpose of either possessing or being possessed. So enchantment is not part of capitalism at all, but glamour, it's simulacrum, absolutely indispensable, I'd say.
There's another question in the Q&A. Can we have an elaboration on living metaphor versus literary metaphor?
Yeah. Well, you know, so literary metaphor is the word itself means to carry across one thing from one thing to another. There's the bridge again. A classic metaphor from philosophy is Achilles is a lion. Now, properly speaking, there should be an exclamation mark on the end of that. It's an amazing discovery. It's extraordinary. Achilles, a man, is a lion. So what that means is that, and this is where the living metaphor comes in our apprehension of Achilles, which may be through something we're reading, so it's literary in that sense, but our actual embodied apprehension of Achilles as a real person, even an imaginal person perhaps, but certainly real nonetheless, is that on the one hand, in the first place, Achilles is a man, but he's also a lion at the same time. So there's something essential about Achilles which saying that he is a lion captures in a way that domesticating that into a simile and saying, oh, well, Achilles is like a lion in certain properties or certain respects. No, that doesn't go all the way. It's an attempt to domesticate metaphor. Because we're not talking, when we say Achilles is a lion, we're not talking about his properties, we're talking about his presence, what his presence was like. So in living metaphor, say I fall in love with somebody. In my case, that would probably be a woman. I experience that the woman is a goddess. I mean, she becomes divine, or always was divine, and now I'm only noticing it now. Okay, doesn't mean she stops being a human woman and becomes entirely divine. In fact, if you forget the divinity or forget her humanity, probably going to get in big trouble quite quickly. So she is both a divinity and a human being at the same time. That's one example out of many, many I could give of living metaphor. And it's how nature works. My teacher was one of my main teachers is somebody called Gregory Bateson. And what he realized was that nature works and evolves through living metaphors. Here's an animal who's got a leg it isn't using, and it's as if nature had said, okay, this animal needs an ear. We can use that leg to be an ear. And it evolves into an ear. And Bateson said, a great deal of our troubles comes from the difference between the way nature thinks and the way we think. So in this attention to enchantment, one of the things I'd like to encourage is us to think metaphorically, full-bloodedly metaphorically, because it ties in the literary metaphor, or the cognitive metaphor, ties in with how the natural world thinks, which is also a metaphor, and not in logic, not in Aristotelian logic, no. Yeah, so that's probably the best I can do at the moment.
Another panelist is ready to ask her question. Sherry?
Oh, okay.
Good evening, Patrick. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I wish you had been here earlier with us. Many of the things that you're talking about have been woven in throughout the day, I feel,
Okay.
in various forms. And it seems like you've wrapped up all of those ends for us into a neat little braid, and so appreciate that, unwittingly even. And so I'm interested in this discussion on enchantment as a mechanism or a vehicle. And so when you're talking about the false enchantment of capitalism as a glamour, you think about that in regard to magic. A glamour is something that covers up what's underneath, right? That hidden aspect. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on Is enchantment simply a glamour to get you to walk through another doorway?
Well, I noticed that in your written question here, you say you wonder if enchantment is simply the doorway that entices you to walk through into the mystical. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think, there are so many forms of enchantment, right? But that's just one form
Right.
of enchantment.
I'm not an expert on mystical experience. Probably it is possible to be one, but anyway, I'm not one. But I do tend to make a distinction between enchantment and mystical experience, insofar as enchantment is, as I tried to say earlier, always has very precise circumstances. It's always quite carnal in the senses. I, as a full body mind, fully engaged body mind, am having this experience in these exact circumstances at this precise moment, okay? I associate mystical experience with something much more, let's say, ineffable, where you've transcended or left behind the precise circumstances, or perhaps left behind your body, or I don't have any problem with that, but it's not enchantment. Because with enchantment, as I said, the deeper into the precise circumstances you go, the more transcendental it gets. It's not a question of leaving them behind. It's a question of going into them even more deeply. Now, it may be that there's someone with a capital S or something that who has an agenda to connect with it, and enchantment is like, I don't know what, the bait or the doorway. I couldn't say about that. I couldn't say about that.
Yeah, and maybe the capital S is the self.
But yeah, that's a metaphor I don't really like. And the reason I don't like it or use it takes the emphasis away from relationship.
Mm.
And for me, we live in a world entirely composed of relationships. And enchantment is a particular kind of wonder at relationship, which in a way, maybe it's reductive, but I could almost say enchantment is a message to pay attention to the particular relationship that is presenting itself to you at the moment. So, for example, in ecology, some of my work involves ecocentrism, and one of the important differences between ecocentrism and deep ecology, or one of its honored ancestors, is that we don't talk about a big self, because that has a lot of problems. Concentrating attention on the self, by implication on me, even if in an expanded way. We want it to be more ecological in the sense of it's all about relationships, and where there's relationships between subjects, which is to say real relationships, there's ethics right away, because I have to take responsibility for how I'm affecting you if I'm in a relationship with you, whatever you are and whoever you are. So I prefer that kind of emphasis.
I think we could have a wonderful long conversation about this. There's a book out right now called All We Can Save. 60 women wrote it on climate change, and I have a chapter in that book, and I talk about kincentric wisdom.
Oh, I'd like to. Maybe you could send that to me.
Yeah, and I think we could have a really long, wonderful conversation about that. Yeah.
Good, excellent. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. That was really a great conversation, and like Sherry said, a wonderful way
Right.
to wrap up. So thank you.
Very
And
well.